Hello and welcome to the Wired Differently podcast with me, your host, Mike Bedford. And today I've got my very special guest, Ron Fish, joining us. Welcome to the podcast, Ron.
Thanks, Mike. Awesome to be here.
I'm really pleased that you're here with us as well. We're going global today because Ron is actually joining us from the US. And tell us about what's the time difference between us, Ron, right now?
Yeah, I think you're 5 hours ahead of me, so I'm getting close to lunchtime, and you're getting close to end of day, I think.
Yeah, and slightly enviously, we just were having a little bit of preamble before we actually started recording about how I'm a little bit jealous that Ron's kind of got really nice weather where he is, and in the north of the UK, not so much here. So I was just asking him if he could actually send some sunshine over, but whether he'll be able to deliver on that, I don't know, but here's hoping. So yeah, I'm delighted to have you on as a guest anyway, Ron, today. And I know we've been connected for a little while on LinkedIn now, haven't we? We've had conversations before. I think some of our thinking is quite aligned and intersects in terms of what we do and how we think and how we operate. And I'm really keen to kind of get you on the podcast and have a conversation with you. And as I say, I have been connected with you a while, and I know you and kind of know a little bit about what you do. But for the benefit of our listeners, then perhaps who don't know who you are or what you do, please can you just tell us a little bit about who's Ron Fish and what do you do?
Sure. So by day, I'm a global talent acquisition leader. I like to make an impact in the hiring programs for the organizations that I support, whether I've been full-time or more recently doing some contracting work. So, working through ensuring that hiring programs are accessible, which has become a real specialty of mine. And then, of course, make sure that they're delivering and meeting corporate goals and related. So that's by day, and then by night, or whenever I have spare time, I am out there sort of evangelizing the accessibility conversations. I think people in HR, people in talent acquisition are uniquely positioned to be able to make an impact much more broadly than just what they do day to day, right? For lots of people, whether it's internal employees who are not acknowledging or not asking for accommodations they could probably create a better workplace for, or whether it's just for hiring programs that are just not accessible. And AI is really amplifying that. I'm sure we'll touch there, but so that's what I do. I'm really passionate about that. So a lot of work as an accessibility champion and then overall talent acquisition leader.
Accessibility evangelist. I like that. That's a great title to have, Rod. I really appreciate that title. That's fantastic. We're gonna have a great conversation. I can feel it just by obviously from knowing you anyway. I've got a bit of a cheat sheet, obviously, for that our listeners don't have, but just from hearing you talk there and your passion about accessibility and talent, I think we're going to get into quite a few interesting areas there. And I think it leads me nicely, I think, into a little bit of a segue into obviously given the context and the name of the show, the Wired Differently podcast, probably gives some of it away. But what does wired differently mean to you then, Ron? And why is it important in your context?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's probably one that's common around here. But wired differently is something that I like to teach hiring managers about. Different doesn't mean bad, right? It doesn't
Yeah.
mean if somebody's not making eye contact or they're a little distracted or they're asking for, can you repeat the question, things like that during interviews. That doesn't mean bad, right? It just means they're wired a little differently. So let's view things from with a wider lens. Let's take a step back, lead with empathy, and really drive a fair and equitable hiring program that's accessible. And that's really what I try to do. One of my keys as an evangelist or champion, however you want to frame it, ambassador, I've been called before, all those exciting terms. And I like to kind of embody that, but really drive that through hiring programs that I build, that I refine, that I transform, and really evangelize that with hiring teams, with interviewers, and everybody that touches the hiring process.
Yeah, that's fantastic. What does it mean to you personally then, if that's your kind of your day to day and you've been an evangelist and kind of trying to change the corporate world for the better to really grasp accessibility and inclusion? What does it mean to you personally?
So I personally don't have a disability, and I get asked all the time, why are you such an advocate? And it's because I have many members of my family with disabilities, both neurodivergent. I grew up with a father who was blind my whole life, which was very normal to me. And people that are part of our community around accessibility have been fascinated by my story. And I'm like, my story is not what I'm focusing on, but the fact that I have been somebody that had a disability like blindness normalized in my life, and that I grew up sort of being one of those elements of accessibility for my father has really it's impacted me to a degree. And then the more that I've moved through my professional career and run into scenarios where we've had to react because we have somebody that's part of the deaf or hard of hearing community, somebody that is neurodivergent, maybe with autism that needs a little bit of support during the interviews, somebody who's blind or low vision, when you are not prepared, you're reacting, and it doesn't create a great candidate experience. So I have been very intentional about building in elements of accessibility and really ensuring that the entire program is accessible. But on the back of, my father being blind, growing up with maybe a little bit more awareness than others might have. Then in my immediate family, I have a son with ADHD and ODD as he grew up, and he's a great success story I can talk about later. My daughter has dyslexia. My wife has dyslexia and ADHD. So I really feel like I'm kind of advocating for them, and they've been very proud of me and the work that I've done. And I've really done it because it's become a passion for me. When I saw such a gap with only 5% of employers out there really being intentional about this, I said, I'm going to be part of that 5% or grow it to 5.1% or whatever it might grow to, and really try to raise awareness, bring visibility, but really being an advocate for family members, getting really passionate about it, seeing that I can make an impact as an HR and talent acquisition leader is really what's brought me to today.
That's fantastic. And I think many of us in this space tend to be motivated by either by what's going on for ourselves or our families or those around us. That's kind of like our fire, isn't it? That kind of gets us really wanting to create that change. I have a bit of a saying, Ron, that nothing motivates like impact. I think that feels quite relevant, I think, to this conversation and what you're saying there as well. Tell me about, then you were mentioning there, and we will get into talking about your family. You were mentioning there about some success stories, because I really like the way that you're sort of framing the conversation in such a positive way as well. And I think that's really important, isn't it, in this conversation more broadly, that the conversation is framed in a much more positive rather than a negative way as well. When we're talking about disability, inclusion, disability, it can often be kind of almost feel like it's got a bit of a dark cloud over it, right? But then from like, more of a kind of positive like mindset and story and actually celebrating success. Tell me a little bit about your successes. I think you were mentioning there you've got a real success story there with was it your son?
My son, yeah, my oldest son. Yeah, what I'll say about the comments that you made is that I have found that nothing makes more of an impact than just simply raising awareness, bringing visibility to it. Because what I find companies struggle with is they have programs and they're very sensitive to gender in the workplace, to race and ethnicity in the workplace, but they just sort of like leave out disability. They forget about it. But I think it's because they don't think that they can make an impact within the organization. They just want to throw a little money at it and donate to a good cause and then feel like they did something, but not realizing that there are impacts you can make by just simply making some adjustments or changes, or factoring in, starting with that universal design idea, thinking that
Yeah.
through, and how would somebody with a disability or that's wired differently navigate through our process compared to somebody who's maybe neurotypical, if there is actually such thing. Because sometimes I say I'm neurotypical, but maybe I'm a little nuts, my wife would tell you, but we keep that a secret, so don't tell anybody. But with that
You
said, yeah,
just
I think it's really important. Yeah, I just let the cat out of the bag, right? But yeah, so really passionate about it, really passionate about how I can make an impact from where I sit. And it becomes infectious. I've been able to impact our finance team and our procurement and facilities teams to make differences at the companies that I've worked for. But with that said, one of the big inspirations, of course, there's my father being blind and all the things that he did and accomplished. But
Yeah.
my oldest son, his name is Tristan.
Shout
Tristan
out, Tristan.
was Yeah, shout out Tristan. He's actually heard me tell the story before on a recorded. I've done talks, and spoke at events, and he's heard me tell the story before, but this story before. But he was a wild child, so full blown ADHD. He had the addition of ODD, which I say is not odd. It's oppositional defiant disorder. So he was that kid that if you were telling him to eat your dinner, hurry up, and it was his favorite food in the world, he would suddenly hate that food because he didn't want to eat it because you told him to. The same translated to school. He was very emotional, so he would react on emotions, and we never knew day to day, like, is he going to have a great day today, or are we going to get called by the police or something saying that he's, being detained? So we had this fear over the years that, we didn't know if he was going to use because he was very smart, didn't know if he was going to use those smarts for something great or if he was going to be part of the penal system at some point. So that's
Yeah.
terrifying for a parent because you can't, do it for them, right? They have to learn to do it. What I would say is, then fast forward when he was about 16, he had a big problem at school and it had to do with a girl and a girl that let him know that she was now with another guy and he freaked out. And he did exactly, Mike, what we taught him, which is use your ability to get out of a situation and vent. So we tell him at home, if you're really mad at mom or dad, go outside, grab a branch, beat a tree, get that energy out, and then refocus and come back to it. So he went down the stairwell, went out the door of the school and screamed really loudly. And I won't repeat what he said, but it was kind of threatening, but just in general, because he was really mad. Well, unfortunately, when he went out that door, it was in the courtyard of the school. So the building's completely surrounded. So windows were open, it reverberated, and everybody freaked out. So he ended up getting suspended from school for a couple of weeks. He went into a really terrifying school for bad kids for those 2 weeks, which freaked him out. I kind of used my recruiting negotiation skills and had a lot of conversations with the principal. He knew what he had done wrong, but it was something he couldn't control, right? It was just his emotions. He unfortunately used that coping skill in the wrong way. So he almost got added to the FBI in the US, the FBI terrorist watch list by the school police officer, which was terrifying, right? Because then he'd be a marked person. Well, we managed to, he was very repentant and apologetic for what had happened. We managed to talk the school into letting him stay and continue his career. Well, from that moment, it really made an impact for him. And then as he hit 17, frontal lobe started to develop. He started to be more mature, make more mature decisions. So bringing this kid from struggling through school because of ADHD and ODD, almost getting added to the terrorist watch list with this incredible event. Today, Tristan graduated with an electronics engineering degree. He has
Amazing.
moved
Congratulations,
from
Tristan.
Yeah, he has moved from Charlotte down to a small town in South Carolina. He landed a job with a plastics manufacturer down there. He is making over $100,000 US annually. He bought his own house at the age of 23 completely on his own merits. So he owns a home. He owns 2 cars. He is working in a great job. He's also been promoted to a lead role. So he's really overcome even a lot of his emotions that he still struggles with a little bit at times. And he's really a success story. And Mike, I like to tell that for 2 reasons. One is for parents that are struggling in the same situation, understand that there are others out here. And most importantly, that there are success stories. It doesn't mean that wired differently is going to lead to a bad outcome. And of course, as parents, we freak out and worry about that. But in this case, it led to a fantastic outcome. We couldn't be prouder of Tristan. When I first talked about it, it'd bring tears to my eyes. I've can hold it together a little bit better now, but we're really proud of him, and he's definitely a success story.
Thank you for sharing. I appreciate you sharing the story, and kudos to Tristan as well. And what would you say out of all of that story, that fantastic story that you just shared there? What was the key success enablers that were in place there to help support that change there, that transformation?
I mean, I think one thing that his mom and I were committed to is consistency. We remain consistent even though he was inconsistent or had trouble with his emotions. So remain consistent and hope that he would eventually catch up, right? And I think that definitely helped keep the structure, ensure that he does maintain standards. And even though he can't control his emotions, ensure that we are having discussions about things. An interesting thing about Tristan is, I sort of automatically understood what a proper reaction to something is. If I, won, a game of tic-tac-toe against my father, I'd be like, yes, I won. I wouldn't be screaming and whooping around the house about that, right? But if you win $1 million, go scream and whoop around the house. Well, Tristan had to kind of learn those we almost had to teach him, here are the proper reactions to these things, or here's how somebody in this situation is feeling. You should give them some words of encouragement. So things that come very naturally to a lot of people, or maybe most people, were things that Tristan had to learn. So I think all of that, and we weren't perfect parents. We made mistakes and we had struggles, but I would say that consistency that we led with, I began to, when Tristan was probably 11 or 12 years old, I began talking to him like an adult. I began having conversations like, here's why we made this decision. I know you're not happy about it and it's not going to change, but I want to give you an opportunity to vent. And then I want to explain to you why we made the decision, why the why behind that decision. And I think those things helped, certainly. And then as he got a little bit older, fortunately, his frontal lobe, the doctor said frontal lobe developed, and he gained some maturity from that, and ultimately success. But I would say that the trials and tribulations impacted too, because he did see how his reaction can make a huge impact and a scary impact. So he also sort of began to learn how to control
He
some of
owned
those
it.
emotions. Yeah, he owned it. Yep.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm hearing is he learned to kind of own it. And that's a really powerful message, I think, there, Ron, as well, isn't it? So thank you for letting us in and for sharing that personal story with us. And
Absolutely.
as you say, understanding that there'll be people potentially listening to this who maybe feel a little bit lost as a parent with what's going on as well, and understanding that it's not just you, you're not on your own. There's lots of people out there who, as parents, want to do the best by our kids, but it's also understanding what do we need, what do we need to do, what things do we need to put in place to enable them to be able to thrive and to work things out and to own it and then to
Yeah,
succeed in their own way, right? I think that's what we're saying.
absolutely.
So I
Yep, I
appreciate
agree.
that. Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate you sharing that story with us. It's a really powerful story to share as well. What then? If you mentioned talent and HR, I'm really dying to get into exploring about your dad as well. Maybe we'll come back to that if we've got time. But it's
Sure.
like your family life story on him. There's so much to unpack, right? I always think whenever you get into these conversations, people are like onions, right? There's so many layers to kind of unpack to get to the who you are, your kind of why. And that's what I was kind of saying as kind of, what my underlying point there, which I think you picked up on, was, well, why does this drive you forward? Why is this important to you? That's when we start kind of picking those layers off of you, thinking of, not that you look like an onion in any way, Ron, but thinking about kind of peeling those layers off that skin and getting underneath and actually finding out, what's firing Ron up here? What motivates him? Why does he do what he does? Right? I think we're starting
Yeah.
to kind of slowly peel away a few little layers there as well. Tell us a bit about like what you do then in terms of, you mentioned HR, talent acquisition, in terms of accessibility. Tell us what that looks like on a day-to-day basis. What do you actually go out there and do? And also, really, I guess a big question is what's making success harder than it needs to be out there right now, thinking about the US. And literally these things are transferable. Most things that you're talking about here are literally, I'm kind of thinking, yeah, that's happening here, yeah, that's happening here, yeah, that, it's like literally it's a universal conversation, right? There's some nuances for sure wherever you go. There's always some kind of nuances, but actually I think broadly speaking, what we're talking about is a universal conversation. It was interesting. We might unpack this later as well when you mentioned about universal design principles as well. Again, that's another universal conversation because when you were saying it, I'm slightly spiderwebbing here a little bit, so forgive me. But when we were kind of talking about universal design principles, what came into my head immediately there was, well, that's the thing about inclusion, isn't it? Inclusion benefits everyone. So if you make small changes for one person, it's likely that many people there are going to benefit from that small change as well. And it's thinking about how do you shift that mindset corporately, if you're thinking about in the workspace, how do you get that, people to kind of shift that mindset from thinking this is, a lot of effort to kind of support one person. Actually, by supporting that one person, you're probably supporting your entire workforce as well, not just that one bit of talent there, that great piece of talent. It's actually thinking about systemically, well, this actually can probably support a lot of people, right? Just by making a few changes to how we do things. And I know we'll get into it, and you're an expert in this space, but excuse me, one thing that always comes to mind whenever I think about recruitment and talent, and I don't know if this is the same in the US. I'm probably going to hazard a guess that it might be, but one of the things that often comes up in the UK when we're thinking about like applying for roles or applications is when you ask, for example, to see the interview questions in advance, that can be like some sort of like big kind of thing to kind of, well, we can't possibly do that, right? That's kind of like some sort of like cheat sheet we're giving you here to be able to do. We couldn't possibly kind of, and it's like, well, actually, what's getting in the way of that? What's making that success harder than it needs to be? What's stopping that? Well, if you give you that, it's unfair to everybody else. So what do you need to do then? We'll give the questions to everybody, right? So again, what's stopping that happening? So it's just thinking. I guess we get a little bit kind of like tunnel vision in our thinking, right? And it's kind of how can we get out of that and think about, again, from a systems point of view, what can we do here that's going to benefit everybody to help us get the best candidate possible?
Yeah, unloaded a lot there,
I
and there's so
did.
many, so many,
Literally,
so many aspects to it. Yeah, you threw the whole kitchen sink and everything at
I
me.
did.
But I will say I've been fortunate to stitch accessibility into a global initiative. So I've done a lot of work in the UK with local team members that were advocates, working with RNIB. It's like Royal National Institute for the Blind. I might have gotten
Yes,
the
it is.
expanded acronym wrong, but worked with
You
them
didn't.
to.
You were spot on.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. So I've worked with them on accessibility of our career site at the organization I was working with. I've done work with team members in India that have built computer labs for blind students where where the company provided accessible laptops and accessibility software. So we've been able to do this in really a global capacity, but certainly a lot of focus in the US because there is a lot of US hiring that's happening. So certainly that has been a large component of it. What I would say is really starting from, if you really look at your workflow, right, from the application stage through interviews to joining, then that's sort of where that handshake happens with HR, where hopefully they're taking things forward in a capacity where they're looking at things from an accessibility perspective. But the first thing I like to tell every company, anybody that's listening, if you're an executive, if you're an HR leader, if you're a talent acquisition leader, I'm literally not telling you that you have to spend all of the pounds or dollars that you have in your budget to do this stuff. It's literally
Mm,
small adjustments, small considerations that don't cost any money, just cost some time. So that's where I got passionate about it, was able to make an impact. But when you look at your job descriptions, do you have a path for accommodations? If somebody who is deaf or hard of hearing or neurodivergent that does want the accommodation you mentioned of questions in advance, or they want permission to turn off their video during the interview or whatever the case may be, how do they let somebody know that? Do you have a path for accommodation? So every job description should have that path, whether it's an email address or a phone number, like literally a phone number that somebody actually answers, not like the dead
yeah.
voicemail that some companies have out there. And then are you welcoming to people that might be coming from that, that ability community? Do you have a statement in there saying that we welcome people of all, cultures and ability levels to
Mm,
apply? These signals that let people know that, oh, this might be an accessible company that's comfortable. And then is your career site accessible? Right. And then is your website accessible? So from a career site perspective, if I'm using a screen reader to navigate your career site, or if I'm using a keyboard by pushing one key because I don't have the dexterity to use a mouse, can I navigate your career site and actually apply to jobs, or is it a mess? Well, I was in a situation where ours was a mess. I was notified by a UX designer who was kind of an accessibility expert and told me that we were eliminating people with disabilities from our applicant pool. And I
mm,
was shocked. I was like, wait, what? Because here I am, father who's blind. I've got kids with, that are neurodivergent. And it was something that I was unaware of. So that brought visibility to me. We took the website from completely inaccessible, there was no accessibility at all, to ADA compliant according to US standards within 18 months. That was a labor of love. I, still have a lot of gratitude to our website team that jumped in. One of the guys caught the bug, got him passionate about it. Then he discovered that the more accessible he designed the website, the faster it ran, the more it simplified the
Mm-hmm.
code. So there was these other benefits, like you said, accessibility makes a better environment for everybody. And sometimes there are hidden benefits you didn't consider. So looking at some of those basic things, and then during the interview process, if somebody with a disability is on the phone with a recruiter and they say, I'm kind of hard of hearing, I might need the manager to repeat the questions, or can they paste it into the chat after they ask it just to make sure I heard them correctly. A recruiter, if they don't know, they don't know, right? They're going to be like, I don't know what to do or how to ask this. So have a process in place, have recruiters trained, at least on a session where they understand if somebody with a disability has a request. I had a company that I consulted with last year reach out, and they were asking me, they had somebody who just ironically, Mike, a candidate asked for the questions in advance. So they sent this like great, well-written email to them, but also said, please send us documentation about your disability so we can validate it. And I said, then they reached out to me and said, what should we actually do here? And I said, well, first of all, lean into yes by default. Like there's no reason to ask somebody for, doctor paperwork
Prove
because
it.
they need an
Prove it.
accommodation during an interview. Like you're creating a whole nother barrier, right? For somebody
Yes.
who's already probably embarrassed or nervous about the stigma. And then now you're making them
You're
show
asking them to prove it,
documentation.
right?
I said, if somebody is asking you to redesign the office and put in an elevator where there's a stairway and it's going to cost your company $100,000, then maybe ask for documentation if you feel like you
Yeah.
need to. But for something that's free, like it's literally just informing a manager, talking to the manager, explaining it. So, there
Yeah.
I could go on, right? I mean, but those are elements of accessibility. And I've done a lot of training sessions, webinars, talking to companies about how to get accessibility off the ground from their hiring program perspective, how to train hiring managers to lead with empathy. My favorite thing to tell managers to do is lead the interview with a question that is, before we get started, is there any way I can optimize your interview experience today? Somebody might say, actually, I haven't had a chance to get away from my desk. Can I go refill my water, really
Yeah.
quickly, right? Which
Yeah.
isn't an accommodation. It's just a nice to have for somebody. Somebody else might say, well, I need to check the captioning. Would you mind just talking for a second so I can make sure that captioning is working correctly? So it can be an accommodation, or it's just creating a better environment. I'd react like, wow, that's a really nice hiring manager, to start that way. So without going off on too much of a tangent there, again, there's a lot more to it. But when we look at the front facing stuff, just kind of welcoming and kind of greasing the skids. So people with disabilities, whether it's neurodivergence, whether it's physical disability, etc., they understand there's a path here, and there's some elements of welcoming people of all ability levels in the job description itself.
No, that's right. And I think we might get into some of this that you've mentioned there. I think there's a lot there to unpack. I throw loads at you there, which you did a great job of unpacking, by the way, which I'm sure from what you told me earlier, you're familiar with the whole concept of spider webbing around in conversations anyway, and going on to multiple points and then coming back to the actual central point at some point. And I'm just thinking there, when you were just saying that, I was just reflecting and thinking, what do you think gets in the way then of organizations in terms of that, I guess, that reaction to, you gave that example there, and the organization saying, sort of, prove it. Can you send us your medical documents or whatever? What do you think causes that reaction? I've got a hypothesis, but I'm interested to kind of hear what yours might be.
I think a lot of it is people are afraid of what they don't know about. So they're nervous about it, right? They're like, oh my God, it could be a lawsuit, or could be this, or could be that. And then some of it is just they don't have knowledge of it. So everybody will default to the letter of the law, so the ADA or the, whatever other, acts are in place, legislations. They're going to just kind of default to that. And then they hear accommodation right away. They're thinking, oh, we got to have them prove it. And we're not asking for an accommodation that's going to cost a lot of money for an employee, right? We're just talking about a simple accommodation that's a really basic thing for an interview. And they really need to learn how to draw, kind of draw the distinction between the two. But I think it's somewhat just not knowing and fear of, the unknown, as well as just lack of knowledge, training, lack of awareness and visibility.
Yeah, my hypothesis aligns well with yours, I think. just from hearing, just testing it out with you to kind of get your thoughts on it. I would probably agree that fear and you don't know what you don't know is what I often discover when I speak to organizations, HR managers, talent people. Is there's that kind of, like you say, that because of the fear of the unknown and the fear of the getting it wrong, defaulting back to whatever the legal definition of the minimum standards you need to put in place not to get sued, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's really interesting. Growing up with a father who was blind, people didn't know how to interact with somebody who was blind. So somebody would come up and talk really loud to my dad, and he would joke and try to loosen him up and say, "Hey, I'm blind, not deaf," and the
Yeah,
person would be like, "Oh my God." But my dad would just joke about it a lot. So I, of course, got a sense of humor from him being crazy and kooky. But, others would come in and be like, would you like me to turn the light on for you? And then he would say, if it makes you feel more comfortable, you're welcome to,
yeah,
sort of thing.
yeah,
But people, if you're not familiar with, to me, it was commonplace. It's normal interacting with somebody who doesn't have sight. But for, probably most of the world that hasn't done that ever or very little, it's something that is new. They're fearful of it or nervous
yeah,
about it. But sometimes it's just treating that person just like you treat anybody else, right? I mean, just come in, have a conversation. Hello, how you doing? Introduce yourself. You don't have to
right.
come in and talk loud or talk in, like really enunciate your syllables like they can't understand what you're saying,
Yeah, yeah,
kind of
yeah, yeah.
thing.
Yeah, it's trying to almost like work out the solution before you actually even asked a question of the person. I think you gave a really good example in that interview where the interviewer came in and you said about, is there anything I can do to optimize your experience? It's about asking better questions, right? It's about asking better questions and just being curious. And I think for me, I don't know what your thoughts are on it, Ron, but just no, I don't have the answer to everything and everyone, and I totally accept that, and I totally accept I'll get loads of things wrong as well. But it's almost overcoming that fear, accepting that you don't know what you don't know, but just being honest about that and just going, "But is it all right if I ask you about this or about that, or what works well for you, what don't work well for you?" And then it's kind of finding a way to match and marry that together with you and them, whatever it is you're doing in that interaction, isn't it? To get the best out of you, because there'll be things that you need that they don't know about, and likewise, there'll be things that they need that you don't know about. There's things that we all need that none of us know about, right? But how do you get over not knowing? You have to ask questions, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I like to talk about this relating to how I manage people. Me personally, as a leader, as a manager, I tailor management to each individual differently. I do understand that everybody, neurodivergent or not, or whatever, everybody does think and see the world a little bit differently, right? So if you put just a blanket management process across your team, you're going to be a lot less successful, and you're going to need to find those soldiers that fit in those specific, the round peg in the round hole. But if you have a more broad view, you have more empathy, and you understand that, hey, so and so's really smart, they just don't gather a lot from a verbal conversation. Send a follow-up email with a bulleted list of what you discussed that you want them to complete by the end of the week, right? And that might really help somebody with ADHD or even dyslexia, sort of thing. So it's really about tweaking the way you lead, the way you manage, and then it calls back to the interview process as well. Don't you focus on the core of the job, not on, well, I don't know if that person would get along culturally with the rest of the team. You're underestimating your
Cultural
team, number
fit.
one. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we could go off on a rant on culture fit, but
Yeah.
I
What
always
is
look at it.
culture and all that?
Yeah. Yeah. The culture that we think we have, and then the culture, there's probably a meme there, Mike, we could make. Like,
I
here's what we
think we
think our
should.
culture is. Here's what everybody else says our
Yeah,
culture is.
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, some really interesting points there. What are you noticing in terms of what's going on where you are then? What are the challenges in terms of accessibility and inclusion over in the US right now? What are the challenges and opportunities?
So I'll say two things. One is I've been in the midst of a full-time job search. I'm pleasantly surprised to see a lot more accessibility statements on job descriptions. I don't know if that's AI helping with that. If so, cool. Hopefully there's something behind it, right? So I don't know if it's just that AI is automatically doing some of those things and people are leaving it in, or if we're actually making an impact with all the visibility and awareness that we're raising. So either way, I'm glad to see it. Hopefully there's stuff behind it. And then there is AI, right? And how is AI impacting the hiring process, creating more barriers for people with disabilities? I was actually the MC for the Recruiting Innovation Summit in Atlanta a couple weeks ago. While there, I was fortunate to also do a talk, sort of a fireside chat with a guy named Raghav Singh, who is an individual in a wheelchair, paraplegic. He has a fantastic story that he shared at the time during that event. And then we, went on to talk about really the impact of AI and how it's creating additional barriers. And I think everybody now knows that AI is, everybody would say AI is not biased. Well, guess what? AI was built by humans. There are just some innate biases built into the algorithms. So you're really raising more awareness there, demonstrating how AI is impacting things. I've got a gentleman named Paul that's part of my network that I've done we did actually a disability panel where we were like the mythbusters for disability stigmas that are out there. So we did this panel, but Paul is he's deaf, and he is looking for a job and was really excited. He got asked to do an interview, and it was AI that called him to set it up, or was going to call him to set it up. So he was doing it in the chat and talking to AI. And then AI said, we want to schedule a phone interview. And Paul said, well, I can't do a phone interview. I'd prefer a video interview. Can I have that as an accommodation? And AI said, okay, I'll cancel the interview. And Paul said, no, wait. I want to,
Yeah.
I want the interview. I just want to do it as a video interview because I need an accommodation. Can that be done? Well, instead of running through some process because there wasn't one, AI just started spouting ADA clauses to him,
What?
saying, oh yeah, it just started like giving him like trying to give him a master class in what accessibility is. And it's part of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And he
Yeah,
was
yeah,
like,
yeah.
that was literally not helpful. So it was a complete gap. But, to say that AI is not biased, I mean, you just have to set it up correctly, right? So when you're implementing AI into your process, you need to be definitely using that universal design mentality and building that, because you can inadvertently exclude, groups of people from underrepresented communities in many ways. And we've seen lawsuits for AI that are excluding people from certain zip codes in the US, which in turn is excluding people of certain cultures. And, there's been
Yeah,
a
yeah.
lot of messiness with it, but AI is definitely creating a lot of barriers, without a doubt, or adding barriers when everybody haphazardly just implements AI to implement AI. So I would say those are the two key things that I'm seeing. So some promise on one side, but then a new barrier. It's almost like
Two different sides of the coin with AI.
building a door through the wall and then putting another wall right on the other side of it.
Yeah, it's a bit like Pandora's box, isn't it, AI?
Yeah.
The when we've opened it, actually now we've opened it, there's so much coming out that we don't really know how to kind of manage it and contain it. And I think you're right. And I know certainly from my perspective, I'm really in the middle on AI. I see the opportunity, I definitely see the opportunity, but I do, like you said there, there's a lot of caveats around it needs to be managed well. If we're going to integrate it into the core of the human processes, which recruitment and talent is very much a human process, or it should be. It should be a very
Yeah.
much a human process because it's about finding the right humans to come and work in your human-based people organization, right? That's fundamentally what it's all about. It's spearheaded by human resources, right? So all about humans. But yeah, bringing AI in to support that, I think, is really important. But who's checking that? Who's moderating that? What's the governance behind that? I think that's a really solid point you make, Ron. I think maybe a point that really needs to be set out in more detail and clarified, and organizations to own that. And who are they working with to make sure and to test that these processes are really accessible? And I think you hit on a really good point that you're now in a position where, and I've seen this from your LinkedIn profile, so I kind of knew that you were in this position, but you're now looking for opportunities yourself out there. So you're really like living and breathing this now. You're testing the processes, for want of a better word, and to actually, for you to kind of see that and kind of say, yeah, you're seeing some improvements in terms of like statements and whatever,
Right.
but actually what you don't see, that's a nice shiny kind of car, right? What you don't see is what's under the bonnet.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And Raghav dropped a data point relating to AI from a study, and it was I don't want to quote, I can't remember, but it was like one of the prestigious universities in the US, I believe, that said that they did a study that showed that when AI is being tested for bias and it knows it's being tested, it tests as virtually unbiased. But that same AI, when you turn around and put it into practice and you plug it in, will begin to, show bias all over the place. So it's really interesting how that's happening. So there's just so much work to do there. It's not perfect, and the fact that we're just trusting it. I like what you said about, we're hiring people. If we're suddenly using a bot to hire people, like, are we actually doing what we're expecting? Maybe for low level, like frontline workers, I need 100 call center workers. Maybe we can trust it there because it might be a bit of a crapshoot anyway. But when we're entrusting hiring the best people or, the right fit for our organization, we're definitely not doing it with AI today. And so many of these AI, and I think the AI companies are to blame because they pitch the aspirational aspect of it, not necessarily what it actually can do today. So you'll hear this term out there in the industry, the AI hiring industry, of hire ready candidates. So our AI, you plug our AI in, it's going to deliver hire ready candidates. Well, what does that actually mean? I mean, are you telling me that AI is taking that person through an entire interview process that we normally would use 4 people to interview that person, and they're hitting them on all the criteria, ensuring that they've got the right background, and you're delivering somebody that I just have to literally pick which one I want to onboard? That's not that's a hire ready candidate, but what they're actually sending you is just a resume on paper, which we could debate too, whether how many fake candidates there are today. They're embellishing resumes and all the craziness that's going on. But what they're really delivering is just a profile that they've had some interaction with. And it still is not a complete picture, not even as complete a picture as you'd get from a recruiter, right? So I
Yeah.
just tell people beware of the hire ready candidate terminology when you're hearing that from an AI vendor that you're considering. Really qualify that, ask what that means, because it doesn't mean
Yeah.
what you and I would assume that it means.
Yeah, no, it's true. And what I'm thinking while we're talking there, Ron, is as well as I often hear, especially from some of my friends in talent space and recruitment space, is around candidates using AI to almost, cheat the system, for want of a better word. So, is there this kind of almost dichotomy where AI is playing off against AI to figure out who's the smartest AI? But where's the
Right.
actual human conversation in there? That's the kind of scary thing as well, is if you've got two AI bots jostling with each other, trying to figure each other out, they're just going to be kind of like almost coming to a stalemate between each other because not one's going to be smarter than the other. But actually, that doesn't solve the underlying challenge here of that you've got an organization who's looking for talent, a good person to come in and fill their role, and you've got a good person who wants to come in and fill that role. But stuck in the middle now, you've got these two AI bots kind of like jostling it out between each other as well. That's probably a reality right now, isn't it?
Yeah, and I do some talks on this topic as well from the pure talent acquisition perspective. And I talk about the high value recruiting model, which is keeping the human right in the spot that, where those lower volume, high value tasks are. Let AI, if we liken it to our lives, like let AI clean your apartment, take out the
Mm,
trash, but managing your relationships, you want to continue to do that. So with hiring, keep the recruiter in those high value areas so you're not running into some of those pitfalls. So there's so much automation that can happen with those high volume tasks. Let AI do your scheduling. Let
mm,
AI help you sort through some resumes. But for having, maybe even AI could, maybe even for frontline workers, if you got a really high volume, maybe it could even do some initial, like checking somebody's what they're looking for salary wise, making sure they're open to
yeah,
relocate, some of the basic things. But when you get into those really high value conversations, is that really where you want AI? I don't, but I think
no,
AI can make an impact and manage a lot of those, sort of like home cleaning, make my bed, the things we all hate to
Yeah.
do, right? But I
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
want
yeah.
AI talking to my grandmother on Christmas Day, telling her
No.
how much I miss her and love her.
Right.
Ron
Yeah.
Ron Ronbot calls up grandma and, is,
You heard it here first, folks. Ronbot. Yeah. What I'm hearing as well there, Ron, is about making sure that we delegate the right tasks to AI, right? That's what
you nailed
that's
it.
what
Yep.
that's what this is about ultimately, isn't it? And think of the opportunities there as well. If we're delegating the tasks that, and just thinking about what you said there about that high volume sifting and all that administration. In my head, I'm just thinking of executive dysfunction hell when you're talking about all those things. I'm thinking, actually, there's a really smarter way that, if I'm thinking of myself in that recruitment talent acquisition, that those are the things I don't really want to go near. This is the things that AI could really help me out with as a talent and acquisition specialist. So I can actually focus on throw myself headlong into that people inside as well. So that's the opportunity here, is to create more opportunities to focus on the human side of things.
I agree. Again, I made the joke about my grandmother, but yeah, I want my human recruiters talking to candidates, having those meaningful discussions about what it's like to work at the company, talking to them more, selling them on the role. And then I want my recruiters talking to hiring managers, right? Having those meaningful discussions to make sure that we're putting a real job description out on the market, not an aspirational one, not one that is what we think that person is going to be doing someday. What are they actually doing now? Are they digging ditches and filling wheelbarrows today? Or are they actually strategically leading a big team? If the team isn't even in place, like why are we putting that in the job description? Because you may end up with a bad culture fit, but maybe it was just a bad job description. So you hired the wrong person into a role because your job description was misleading, maybe unintentionally, but you just put out a bad job description that wasn't real. So that's where I want recruiters coaching hiring managers on those nuances and maybe move them away from those higher volume elements that can be managed, through automation or through AI.
Yeah, so AI is a big topic of conversation, right? That cuts across nearly all spaces. I think that's what I'm hearing from you in terms of that, challenge and opportunities here as well. And there's a real human opportunity. I think that's what I'm hearing here. We it's not here to take and make all our decisions for us, is it? And there's a real opportunity here for folks who are wired differently as well through AI to have opportunity, to have more accessibility and more opportunity to roles that maybe previously weren't available or accessible to them through new technologies and through an emergence of these new technologies. And how do we embrace that? And I was interested to kind of hear there about your thoughts about job descriptions as well. I mean, we could have a whole podcast just on job descriptions, I think, and how then you talk about universal design principles. And from a job description is basically really a list of things that some people have made up based on what they think that role is going to need and what they think the right person is going to be for that role. But as you know, when someone often gets into that role evolves and changes anyway. So it doesn't end up actually looking anything like that job description 6 months down the line, right? As well. So, again, thinking of those opportunities, like accessibility and creating more opportunities. Think about job design and how you can, be honest about actually we want to work with the right candidate over time to shape this role. And if the role needs to change, the role design can change too. It's not fixed in stone. So if there's certain elements of this that you come in and find difficult that you might not have known about and we might not have known about, actually down the line we might be able to shift that and change that and think about role design and how we can change that role design to make it more accessible and inclusive.
Yeah, I mean, an incredible number of people after joining a company will say that the role has materially changed from
Mm,
what it was intended to be. Sometimes that happens right out of the gate because we didn't really describe the role that well. So I do think that having more of a role design approach where you work with the hiring manager, and whether you're using a platform to do it or just good solid discussions to work through that process, think about what is the actual day to day going to look like. And I've had managers that want to hire a leader and they're hiring a leader. I need somebody who can lead a team of 25 to 30 people. And you're like, well, wait, there's only a team of 3 people right now. Well, yeah, they're going to have to hire them and, everything. But, it sounds like there's going to be a lot of hands-on work right now. They're going to have to really build this thing from scratch. Yeah, that's right. So that's why I need this lead. It's like, well, hold on, let's think that through logically. Trying to hire somebody for this aspirational role, they may not want to do that grunt work up front, right? So you might need somebody that has that mentality, or at least inform individuals up front and have real conversations, which the recruiter can do, have that real conversation about what a day in the life and the role would look like. So if somebody that's not the role they're looking for, then they can just self-eliminate. They can say, well, I'm actually looking for a role where I would be leading a team of 25 plus people in a strategic capacity, not really looking to do that hands-on marketing or that hands-on finance. I really want to be that global leader. Well, that's not the right person for the role. So now we can avoid some cultural mismatches, or whatever you want to call them, in that regard. Or if we're focusing on the core responsibilities for the role and we're measuring everybody the same way each time, and we have a concise approach to our interviews, now we're giving individuals that are part of those disability communities or the ability community and, neurodivergent or otherwise, we're giving them more of a fair shot, right? We're building some equity in. And then if we're training hiring managers to think from that accessibility perspective, to think from that wired differently perspective, say, this person's response or reaction or eye contact was different than I expected during the call, but they actually have really great skills. So, I don't think it's a bad thing to notice those things, to make a note of them, but make a decision at the end based on the full picture, right? Don't look at one of those things and then be like, I don't think they're going to be a culture fit. And now confirmation bias,
Yeah,
dominates
yeah, yeah.
the rest of the interview. You're just trying to rule the person out for that reason. Be objective. Take all the information, evaluate your pros and cons at the end. And then if that person is just not the most qualified candidate, then hire the most qualified candidate for the role. Fair enough. But have a consistent approach to the way you hire. And that's going to enable people from the ability community that might struggle otherwise to be much more successful, for sure.
You've almost answered my final question, I think, there, Ron, without me even having to ask it. Just curiosity, what does it say on your shirt?
The future is accessible.
Perfect, perfect. I think that dovetails
That's
really nicely into that kind of final question, is around, which some of that you just answered there, by the way. So amazingly well done there. Is what, in your mind, then, does a truly accessible talent recruitment onboarding process look like?
I think it looks like a very aware organization. It has that, those signals in job descriptions, signals on the website, links to a way to get accommodations to your website, or an email address or a phone number. So I think you're sort of like creating those signals that if I'm somebody that's autistic and I'm nervous about applying for this position because I saw all those nice to haves and I'm not sure I have that and I'm doubting myself, or I'm worried about the stigma, but I'm seeing all these signals and signs all over the place that this company seems to be pretty accessible, and they've got this great accommodation statement that isn't the ADA one, or the one I'd always see in the UK. It's actually a meaningful one that's going to welcome them in, and they're going to tend to apply. So I think creating that welcoming atmosphere, ensuring that you've got an accessible career site, and the other elements there is really the best place to start. Again, we're not talking about a lot of money, and I can give any of your viewers, anybody that's listening to the podcast, tips on how to, advocate for this, how to get it. And when you come to a CEO and say for the cost of what I call free 99 is the price to do this, they're typically they get right on board, especially in the
Yeah.
era where everybody's trying to go to AI. When you say, hey, we can make an impact and create these things that are going to further our DEI initiatives, or are going to create a better culture, better employer brand, better brand overall. Because remember, I'd like to tell people this too, Mike, the only people with disabilities are not just in our applicants and our employees, our customers, right? So if I'm a customer trying to navigate your website and I can't do it effectively, you might have lost that customer. And I don't have the data points like right on the top of my head, but there are data points that talk about the disability owned businesses out there, like how many billions of dollars or billions of pounds they control that can make an impact. So we got to think about this from that universal design perspective to really make an impact all around.
Yeah, no, thank you. So, I mean, we could go on for another hour at least, couldn't we? In
I
so many
think so.
ways we, so many
I didn't
different
even
rabbit
talk about
holes.
my dad. Yeah, I didn't tell you about the time that my dad,
Quick, tell us about your dad.
so let me tell
Quickly, give
you,
us a story
let me
about your
just
dad.
tell you, let me tell you a funny story. So I already told you that he likes to joke around. I came home from school one day and we had a poodle named Pierre. And Pierre comes walking across the living room towards me. And I was looking at Pierre and I was like, something's not right. Like he had these big chunks out of his fur and stuff. And so my dad then comes walking through and I'm like, Dad, what happened to Pierre? And he looked at me indignantly, looked at me even though he's blind, but he looked at me and said, I cut his hair. Why? So you can imagine I like erupted in laughter, cracked up. The family to this day still jokes about that time, but thinking about a blind man cutting a dog's hair, it came out as good as you would expect, and
Yeah,
is like part of the lore, the legend of the family around my dad. But he had a
Ron
great sense of
Senior.
humor. Yeah, he had a great sense of humor at all times, and that was definitely one that I don't think he intended it to be funny, but it was hilarious.
Thank you. What a lovely way to end the podcast, Ron. And thank you so much you've shared so much with us in this podcast. We've shared really personal stories. We've talked about your passion for accessibility and inclusion. We've talked about talent, acquisition, recruitment, hiring, and we've talked about universal design principles. I mean, we've covered a lot in
Covered a lot.
an hour, right? We've covered so much. I mean, we could talk for much longer, but I really appreciate you sharing what you have shared with us. Thank you so much, and for sharing your expertise and knowledge as well. That's been really appreciated. And finally, Ron, just for people, you mentioned there about there's so much that you could share with people. If people want to reach out to you and contact you, be very happy to. How can people get in touch with you? What's the best way for anyone listening to this who thinks, actually, I'd love to have a chat with Ron and take him up on that? What would they need to do?
Yeah, I mean, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm typically involved, Mike, as you know, just like you are in discussions around accessibility and these topics. Of course, mine are slanted towards talent acquisition in many regards, but building an accessible hiring program. Happy to have chats with people. Happy if somebody wanted to bring me in to consult to help them actually build it out and make that happen. Definitely would be interested in having those discussions, but hit me up on LinkedIn. I do have a Linktree account as well. If somebody wanted to see some of the talks, any of the talks that I've talked about that I've done should be linked there. There's a link from my LinkedIn to that as well, but hit me up on LinkedIn. Happy to give out, some tips, any information to your listeners and help out. And I think we're doing what we wanted to do, what we set out to do, Mike, which is raise awareness, bring visibility. I'll look forward to promoting this and, love what you're doing. And I know you're doing it as a
Appreciate
speaker
that.
on the tour and really love to see it. And I think if we just keep, working together, we're slowly making progress and sort of shifting the, kind of the overall view in the market. And I think raising a lot of awareness so people's natural empathy will kick in and they'll start to look at things from that universal design perspective.
Thank you so much, Ron. I appreciate everything that you do as well. So thank you so much for everything that you do as well. And I look forward to continuing our conversations beyond this podcast. So thank you so much. And
Absolutely.
thank you for being such an amazing guest.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, giving me the platform.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Take care.